6e jour d'expérience, des images commencent à sourdre, comme des aveux. Un matin du temps de paix. Une chambre du temps de paix, une vraie chambre. De vrais enfants, de vrais oiseaux, de vrais chats, de vraies tombes.
Good morning. I'm here to join my colleagues and friends to talk about the book of Chris Marker's translations. We're going to begin by introducing ourselves, and I will start. My name is Steve Unger. I'm a professor emeritus at the University of Iowa, where I've taught French, film studies, comparative literature since 1976. Before that, I taught for 4 years at Case Western Reserve University. This is the fourth book I'm publishing at the University of Minnesota Press. I've also published books on Roland Barthes, Michel Cléo de Saint-Cassette, and Popular Front Paris, and Maurice Blanchot. Excuse me, I was blocking the name. I've also published over 100 shorter pieces of articles and reviews, and I'm very happy to be here with you today. Sally, would you like to go on?
Hi, I'm Sally Shafter, and I teach film studies at Framingham State University. It's a pleasure to be here today to speak about Chris Marker and his early writings on film. I was delighted when Steve Unger originally contacted me in January 2021 to translate this early work by Marker. This project follows on my two previous translations of filmmakers, first the writings of Jean-Marie Straub and Daniel Rouillet, published by Sequence Press. Then, of course, the book of interviews that Jean-Michel Frodon, here present, did with the Chinese director Jia Zhengke, published by the Film Desk. Let me note that I will be pronouncing the filmmaker's name à l'américaine, since it is thought that Chris Marker adopted his surname alias after the magic markers that American GIs brought with them to Europe. Finally, I would like to say how excited I am to be here with Jean-Michel and Sam, because they are, in fact, our very first official readers.
Jean-Michel.
Hi, everyone. I'm delighted to be with you. My name is Jean-Michel Frodon. I'm basically a film critic. I've been writing for French daily Le Monde. I've been editor-in-chief of Cahiers du Cinéma. I now write online for various online magazines, French ones, obviously, but also for printed magazines in various countries, mostly in Spain and in South Korea. I also teach about cinema in Paris in Political Science Institute, and I am occasionally a curator and programmer in various conditions of frames to share ideas and love for cinema the best I can. I have been knowing Chris Marker for a very long time, actually, since I was a kid. And then I've been working about what he did and what he left to us after he passed away 12 years ago now. And it's very important for me that this dimension of his work, which is not so much well known, is made available in English thanks to Steve Unger's and Sally Shafter's work about the text written by Chris Marker.
Sam.
Hi, everybody. My name is Sam Iorio. I'm associate professor at Hunter College in New York City in the CUNY Graduate Center. I teach French cinema and French film theory and French literature there. My research concerns mid-century France mostly, and French cinema. And I've been a great fan and a real follower of Chris Marker and many French film directors since the 1990s, more or less, and have written on Marker's work in various places for Film Comment and for Trafic. And I'm so pleased, having done the legwork when I was a grad student of photocopying article by article from crumbling issues of Esprit from the University of Pennsylvania Library, the actual pieces. It's such a pleasure to have this book of translations in English easily accessible and readable by new audiences. So thank you, Steve and Sally, for making this happen.
Thank you. I'd like to move to round two. We each have time to make opening statements. I will start. I'm going to read from the manuscript. I cannot imagine post-war French cinema without Chris Marker. That is, without La Jetée, his time travel short composed almost entirely of still images, or Letter from Siberia, whose quirky commentary redirects conventions of the travelogue toward those of the filmed essay, or the epic account of the global left's failed revolutions in A Grin Without a Cat, or the synth-generated effects in his experimental Sunless, or the nods to Marcel Proust and Alfred Hitchcock in his interactive CD-ROM Immemory. Still, even the most ardent fans of Marker's films and videos have yet to contend with the full import of a simple truth. Chris Marker wrote. In fact, he wrote a lot. This was especially true between 1945 and 1955, when his publications included a play, a novel, short stories, a literary monograph, poetry, radio scripts, film commentaries, translations, and roughly 100 articles, essays, and book entries. The attention generated by Marker's photographs, films, videos, installations, and digital projects often reduces his writings, and his early writings in particular, to passing mention or summary. Yet, for François Crémieux, Marker's publications in the Parisian monthly Esprit, starting in 1946, formed the basis of his subsequent work over the next 6 decades. Quote, his Esprit writings make of him what he will be. In other words, the moment when the man born Christian Hippolyte François Georges Bouche-Villeneuve adopts the pen name Chris Marker coincides with his initial post-war publications, a majority of them in Esprit. Marker becomes Marker through his Esprit writings. This book began as a study of 9 film-based articles Marker wrote for Esprit between 1948 and 1955. Its initial form was a paper I presented at a 2015 Yale University conference Dudley Andrew organized on André Bazin, post-war French journals and the politics of popular culture. The project developed after I commissioned film scholar and translator Sally Shafto to translate Marker's film writings in Esprit, along with others he contributed concurrently to the newly launched Cahiers du Cinéma and Positif monthlies and to 2 anthologies. This expanded corpus of 20 texts tracks Marker from his mid-20s to his mid-30s as he thinks about film form, style, history, and adaptation. They document his contributions to the cinephilia Antoine de Bec characterizes as the invention of a gaze and the history of a culture from 1944 to 1968. Finally, they sketch a portrait of the writing Marker in the guise of what Jacques Rancière, via Roland Barthes, might have called a pensive spectator, Rancière, attuned to the emotional charge, Barthes, of still and moving images. 3 goals for this project: to translate a formative dimension of Chris Marker's post-war activities that remains largely understudied and unaccounted for on both sides of the Atlantic. Update critical understanding of Chris Marker using materials his literary heirs have made available since his death in July 2012. Explore what these new materials contribute to ongoing reassessments of Marker's films, videos, and digital works. As is appropriate, I offer a final word from Marker's colleague, friend, and mentor, André Bazin. Quote, Chris Marker is of this new generation of writers who believe that the time of the image has come, but who do not find it necessary to sacrifice the power and virtues of language that remains the privileged interpreter of intelligence. Which means that for Chris Marker, the commentary is not what is added to images, chosen and edited in advance, but almost the primary fundamental element that nonetheless acquires meaning and usefulness only with reference to the images that accompany it.
Okay, that was great, Steve. I was tasked in this project with translating a slim part of Marker's prolific literary output in the post-war period. These articles have been meticulously culled and assembled by Steve. At the Chris Marker conference in Paris in June 2022, titled Chris Marker, Écrivain en premier, Chris Marker, a writer first and foremost, I delivered a paper that discussed translation as offering an X-ray into the person being translated. And I do think that these 20 essays, selected mostly from Esprit, but also from several other journals, do provide keen insights into the young Chris Marker at a key transitional moment in his life. He was 27 in 1948 when he wrote his first essay on film, a review of Laurence Olivier's Henry V, and 34 in 1955 when he wrote his last, a review of Elia Kazan's On the Waterfront. During the 7 years in which Marker wrote these essays, his literary activity reached an apogee. He wrote a novel, Le Coeur Net, several plays for the radio, and was also translating in this period. In this formative period of intense writing, Marker was also transitioning to becoming a new kind of author, a film auteur. In 1947, he made his first film, long lost, titled The End of the World, according to the Archangel Gabriel. During the time that he wrote these 20 essays, he made 2 more films, the documentary Olympia 52, a feature-length documentary about the Summer Olympics, and Statues Also Die, co-directed with Alain Resnais, the first of Marker's so-called film essays. It was mostly fun translating Marker because of his sharp intelligence and fine sense of humor. He often ends with a sharp, invigorating turn of phrase. In one of his memorable bon mots, he describes Walt Disney, whom Marker disliked for his anti-labor practices, as an, quote, épicier daltonien, or a colorblind grocer. Marker's personality clearly shines through loud and clear in these essays. Initially, I was surprised that he rarely addresses French cinema other than a highly positive review of Cocteau's Orpheus and Dreyer's The Trial of Joan of Arc. Raymond Bellour has described Marker as l'homme monde, a world man, and it's clear that already in the late 40s and early 50s, Marker was becoming engaged with what was going on outside the French hexagon in the humanist moment following the Second World War. These 20 essays include 2 major essays on post-war German cinema, 1 on Mexican cinema, and 2 extended essays on American cinema. And they are all based on Marker's first-hand experience in those countries. A translator is well placed to be attuned to an author's frequent use of certain words, and I noticed a recurrence of 2 words in particular, vrai et réel, or true and real. These repetitions triggered my memory of Marker's use of them a decade later in La Jetée. I have a short clip from La Jetée where the film's narrator recalls seeing, on the 10th day of the experiment, a real bedroom, real children, real birds, real cats, real graves, end quote. As if at the end of a war that had devastated a large portion of the globe, the real and the true had become a veritable obsession for Marker. This emphasis both correlates to Bazin's contemporaneous concern with vérité and post-war realism, even if, interestingly, Marker never wrote a single article on Italian neorealism. This emphasis on the vrai, in turn, anticipates the cinema vérité movement in France, with most famously Jean Rouch and Edgar Morin's Chronicle of a Summer in 1960, and the call for greater truth regarding the French government's use of torture in Algeria. Thank you.
So the first thing I would like to say here would be to praise Sally Shaftow's work for this book, because I know how difficult it is to deal with Marker writing. It is a multi-layer expression, multi-level way of addressing topics, which is at the same time the quality of his work and its power to suggest several directions, several ways to understand, to address, to react, to move forward based on whatever he's dealing with. And it is really meaningful that there is a symmetry, so to speak, a similarity at least on the multiplicity of the practices Chris Marker had in his life. It has been said as a filmmaker, as a writer, but also he was a photographer, and he has an extensive work as an artist in photography. He was a musician and composer. He was also what we would call a geek, somebody who'd been creatively using digital tools and technologies all the way through. He was a publisher and a designer of publishing. So in Marker's practices, there were this multiplicity of capacities, which I would say he would be excellent in each of them, but not as separate practices, but as components, as a coherent and comprehensive way to embrace the world and relate with the world. And this is what he's been doing all his life. It is absolutely true and meaningful to remind, as it has already been done here, and that it is very clearly done in Stephen Hunger's introduction for the books, that it comes from writing. And writing is seminal to all the other practices. He started to write very young. He published novels, short stories more exactly, and poems as a teenager, even before World War II. And he was seeing himself as a writer when he was in his first years, and he moved to other practices from the writing process. But on the other hand, one could say that inside his practice of writing itself, he has been incorporating the multiplicity of ways to relate with situation, with people, with memories, with knowledge, with theories, with history. And that translates in every piece of writing he's been doing. Among so many things he was in his life, he was also a traveler, and he's been traveling the world extensively. He's a global artist and thinker, ahead of many others in the second part of the 20th century. And traveling for him was a political act, and it related with politics. And this means that he's been relating with different cultures, different way to address the world, to understand relations between people and between communities. And this is also feeding his writing. When he starts writing for Esprit in the second half of the 1940s, he's also involved in cultural practices, multicultural practices, especially inside what is known as peuple et culture, people and culture, which was a huge organization after the end of World War II in France and then in Western Europe, coming from the French resistance and intending basically to support the idea of peace through sharing culture with people, with a large amount of people beyond the most educated and those who had the easiest access to culture. And that he was an activist in this. He was the head of the Journal of the People and Culture organization. He was traveling a lot at the time, and it translates as well in the list of the texts that Steve Hunger has collected. All of this, building this multi-layer, this multi-level way of thinking, way of acting, way of building relations between components which are usually separated. And all of this is inside the writing itself. And this is what Sally Shafto had to deal with to translate it in English, a text which are already immensely complex for French readers. Complex doesn't mean difficult. The writing is not difficult and it's not obscure, but it's always playing on many levels, like somebody having several musical instruments at the same time, which are sounded together through his writing. And the way it does translate, the way it is made accessible in English by Sally's work is amazing, because we know, even from a French point of view, how complex it is. Again, it's complex, not complicated, but so rich that this is defining a certain relation towards writing in general, and in our case, between a certain relation together, writing and cinema, since all these texts relate with cinema, and this multi-layer writings deals with a multi-layer perception of what cinema is and what cinema can do.
I would like to just maybe add from what Jean-Michel has said already. What struck me in reading the text really was something similar, that I really was struck by the care and attention that Steve and Sally devoted to the presentation of these texts, both in the translations, as Jean-Michel has already said, and also in the annotations and making sure that the references and the text can really reach a contemporary English language reader in 2024. What you've really given us, on the one hand, is kind of a treasure box. It's also a source book. There's so much, not only about Marker himself, but there's also a really interesting perspective on cinema that comes to the fore in these texts. When I was a student, these essays were part of my film school. I think that they develop a real individual perspective on a cinema landscape, providing a kind of account of films that were being released at the time that's different from what André Bazin was writing or what Truffaut would go on to write, or Steve, as you mentioned in the intro, what Romer would write about later as well. I think we get a fresh perspective on American cinema, which would be of great interest to anyone working on American film history. There's a choice of films, a selection of points of intervention, which I think are distinct from what Manny Farber was writing or James Agee were writing in the US, for example. And I also think we get, as Sally, you noticed, that the German cinema essays are super, super interesting. And the Mexican cinema essay is also really, really rich. And there's a whole kind of wave of films and directors and names and references, which I don't necessarily see in other places. I haven't read anyone who cared as much about Gerald McBoing Boing, for example, or about the UPA, film animation studio. And I think there's a film history dimension. There's a lot about animation here. There's a media archaeology kind of angle, which comes out in the essays about 3D, especially in CinemaScope. And there's pieces about the avant-gardes as well. In addition to, Sally already mentioned the unbelievably beautiful essay on Orpheus by Cocteau and the piece about Joan of Arc by Dreyer, which are such models for engaged and passionate film scholarship. It was just such a pleasure to be able to read these essays again as if they were new.
Jean-Michel, you very modestly forgot to mention that you were the co-curator of the 2018 Cinémathèque Française exhibition, Chris Marker, Les Sept Vies d'un Cinéaste, as well as co-editor of its accompanying catalog, Chris Marker, Le Monde. But at the outset today, you mentioned that you knew Marker from when you were very, very young.
Okay, well, it happens that my parents were friends with somebody who was an editor, a woman, Jacqueline Mépiel, who's been working with Chris Marker extensively in the 60s, and especially when Marker was coordinating the omnibus film Far From Vietnam at the middle of the 1960s, and that he was there. I was a kid at the time, but of course we would have lunch on Sundays. And there was this impressive man. Physically, Chris Marker was very impressive. He was very tall. He looked a little bit like Nosferatu. And he had a very strange voice and a very metallic voice. We know his voice since he has a voiceover. It is very present. It is often present, not so much, but from time to time present in his film. As much as Marker was extremely reluctant to appear physically, and from the end of the 60s, totally disappeared or almost totally disappeared from the audiovisual scene or any or photographies, etc., and wouldn't be seen even in public events. But he was present through his voice in several occasions. So this very specific voice can be heard and be an are part of his personality. But he was a very bizarre kind of person who was very solitary and with a huge amount of connection worldwide, but only on a one-to-one kind of relations, and he would not be part of groups, never again. He was part of groups in the French Resistance, obviously, and in the following years, and as a publisher in the Le Seuil, where he did an extensive work in book publishing. But afterwards, he would be more and more solitary, and especially after May 68. And at the same time, he would connect with people all over the world. Later on, in the late 80s, after I had become a film critic and journalist, we would meet again. And I would meet him repeatedly in his studio. He lived in a place which was at the same time the way he was living in and the way he worked, which was an immense jungle of working devices. His own, as a filmmaker, as a photographer, as an immense reader. He read extensively, and having been in position to work on his archive after he passed away. It's endless amounts of books, of course, but also of clips from magazines and so many kinds of archive, but his photos, the music, and the recording. He would record whatever he could with any available device at any time and accumulating all of this. And it looked like a terrible mess, but it was not. It was actually very well organized, but according to his brain. And it was not obvious for anybody else than him. And he was willing to discuss completely unpredictable topics. Nobody would have the time to say anything like, the weather is nice. Time was short. Among things which were important for him were politics all over the world. He had immense documentation. We had to work on this for the exhibition you already mentioned, Sally. We worked on together, Raymond Bellour, Christine Van Asch, and myself in 2018. We made in French Cinémathèque. But we would talk about maybe the most important thing for him, which is cats. And about cats, it was an endless discussion because it was a very serious topic for him and how it related with issues of humans and non-humans, but also about power and different kind of power relation and relation between the living and the dead. And it was really something that he would address, as well as every known form of art or this kind of thing. As you can hear, I could start speaking about Chris for a very, very long time. But just to move forward very, very fast, after he passed away in 2012, due to the proximity I had with him, together with a small group of persons, approximately 20% in Paris or nearby, including, for instance, Agnès Varda. We took care of what he left behind, since he had no children, and through various stories which could be told elsewhere, it was built the conditions to deposit everything he left behind, which is immense. Maybe the most complex being the hard drives, the huge hard drives with millions and millions of documents inside, organized like Marker's brain, was deposited to the French Cinémathèque. And from this treasure, we built, among other things, the exhibition and the catalogue, which is not only the catalogue of the exhibition, but which tried to be a first comprehensive depiction of the immensely various facets of Marker's work and practices, and the way it worked for him, what it meant poetically, intellectually, and politically, all the way through until his last breath.
Oh, that's really fantastic, Jean-Michel. I might come back to the archives in a moment, but I want to ask Sam a question. I've recently read your superb essay titled The Fragile Present, Statues Also Die with Night and Fog, and I see that you had an epistolary relationship via email with Marker, and I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that, how long it went on. You have a wonderful quote from him in here about the making of Statues Also Die.
Yeah, thanks, Sally. I guess there's not really a ton to say. I'd emailed Marker a couple of times, and I think I was involved back in 2002 or 2003 with Film Comments. They did a pretty extensive dossier of writing on Marker, and I put a couple of pieces into those issues with my friend Michael Chaikin. And at that time, I entered into contact with Pierre Lhomme, and we sat down and had coffee one day at his apartment. And I started to email a little bit with Marco around those times. And I had very specific researcher questions, which I soon realized were sort of pointless because it's not really fair to expect anyone to remember, specific details about something that they did in something 50 years ago, or whatever. But we had a few exchanges, and he was very generous, as he always was. And I think that little paragraph that's in the article was very generous on his part to kind of talk about that film and where it came from and where the title came from, which was modeled on, according to Marker, Hangmen Also Die by Fritz Lang. That's the long and the short of it.
Yeah, well, it's just a wonderful piece. Steve, turning to you, you have this wonderful quote by Marker in your in-depth introduction where you say that Marker once said about Nicole Verdresse, "Je lui dois tout." I owe everything to her. Could you elaborate on that a little bit? In what sense did Marker owe everything to Nicole Verdresse? And maybe you want to begin by identifying for our audience who was Nicole Verdresse.
Verdresse was a filmmaker and novelist born in 1911 and died in 1964. I think the film that really moved Marker, was one of his first professional assignments, was Paris 1900. And he saw in that film, or I say he saw, or I'd like to say he saw in that film, the use of documentary techniques with an edge, with an argument. And this is done cinematically. There's a moment, 45 minutes into the film, when a man jumps off, wants to fly, and he falls. And that fall coincides with the movement toward the inevitability of war with Germany in 1914. And I think he needed a role model, and he had many role models, tutor figures, but Verdresse was the one who took faith in him, who had faith in him, and that's why he plays such a large role.
They said it together, Chris Marker and Alain Resnais, how much they owed to Nicole Verdresse and how much Paris 1900 was seminal for them, especially in the work of editing already existing footage and the way to make new works out of pre-existing footage. She was so important compared to his almost forgotten position in the history of cinema.
Yeah, well, certainly she's not known here in the United States. I think she's a little better known in France. And of course, Resnais had been her assistant, right, on Paris 9100. Steve, do you want to say something also about another important figure in Marker's life in the immediate post-war period, in addition to Bazin? And that, of course, is Joseph Rovin.
Well, Rovin is the real name. Rosenthal was a German who adopted French culture in the 1940s and worked with Marker on Peuple et Culture to organize seminars of goodwill and education between France and Germany. And this is a model for what he's going to do with Peuple et Culture for the next 5 years following the end of the war, which is to make cinema a tool of education beyond book learning, to make it a popular, not just entertainment, but a tool to organize people's knowledge to get more out of life than material goods. And he wrote a book, I think the translation is of a Frenchman who remembers having been German.
Yeah, he's a wonderful figure in that post-war period, and so important for Marker and his growing interest in post-war German cinema. 2 other questions. Jean-Michel, you probably don't have the answer to this, but I'm going to ask it anyway. As a scholar interested in archives, I wonder if you think a copy of his first lost film might ever turn up. Films do occasionally resurface. I remember the surprise and delight that followed the rediscovery in 2014 of Philippe Garrel's short film, Actua 1, filmed during the events of May 68 after having been misplaced for 45 years, or Bresson's first film, Les Affaires Publiques, after it went missing for 50 years and was rediscovered in 1987. Could there be a copy of it in the Cinematheque?
My opinion, it is only an opinion, is that this film does not exist. It's not that it is lost, it's that it was never shot, or that it is a construction of the mind, which has been useful for several people to accompany the relation towards cinema. The track which led towards cinema, towards the world of images from the world of words regarding Marker. So my guess, but again, I am not saying anything as a positive affirmation, just what I think is that this is part of storytelling. Marker has been telling a lot of stories all his life, and he was acknowledging that he had so many pseudonyms, and he was he was not cheating. He was playing with his birthplace, with his date of place, with his biography, with so many things. And I am guessing, but with a kind of insistent belief that this is part of a meaningful storytelling. it's not meaningless at all. It tells something through the process it is supposed to be part of, but because also what he says, what he writes when he shoots Olympia in 1952, you can tell his first real essay as a filmmaker, his first try, and the way he discovers cinematic language at this moment, even having been through other relation with filmmaking before, working together with directors, and of course accompanying, because Peuple et Culture had many various fields of activity, including film screenings and discussions, which he did together with André Bazin, among others, but Bazin and him were close on this practice. So his relation with cinema is strong, and cinema is also part of a larger cultural activism, so to speak, but the filmmaking itself, for me, had not begun with this dreamlike object, which I believe is very interesting as a dreamlike object.
Well, isn't there, Steve, is it you who quotes Alain Resnais as having seen the film?
Maybe they were in cahoots, as we say in the United States.
That would be my guess.
I'm not so sure, but I think you lay out a really good theory there. I wonder if you, as we move on to the next segment, could talk about, in your opinion, Marker's place in post-war French cinema.
Yeah, that is a really good question. For me, in reading these articles, and I spent the last week or so going back and rewatching some of the films, what really struck me in both cases was the combination of intimacy and distance that you get. It's a very personal, very idiosyncratic, almost intimate, sort of form of address that we're getting in so much of this work. But by the same token, it's often filtered through different perspectives, through pseudonyms, through allusions, quotations, literary style, and things like that. And I think the really valuable thing that Marker develops over the course of his career, and Jean-Michel sort of mentioned the drift from engagement with Peuple et Culture and working with Seuil and engagement with the Gourmet Betkin, to this more solitary moment, is he really does put forward a very persuasive idea of the possibility of being an outsider. And that position of being on the outside doesn't necessarily mean at all that he's disengaged, because we know very well how passionately he followed, his interests, as well as whether they were political or whether they were aesthetic. But I think that idea of having an outside perspective, with all the risks that entails, there's certain things which become visible in his work because of that stance that are visible nowhere else. And I think that kind of, especially at a moment when everything is kind of devoured by this notion of industries and careers and personal brands and everything else, Marker makes it clear that you don't have to go to Cannes, you don't have to go to Sundance, you can make films, you can do things. And he has a talent of not necessarily being an underground filmmaker or an experimental filmmaker, of which there are many, but he was able to navigate between participation and recognition in a broader field of the industry while retaining his independence. And I think that's incredibly valuable as a model for filmmakers. It goes back to that quote that he liked to cite at various times about how he was the most famous of unknown filmmakers. And I think that was kind of what he was striving for. And that's something that we should, all consider, as being a possible position to occupy in the cultural field.
Great. That's really wonderful.
I have one more question for Jean-Michel. As a member of the équipe that's looking into the materials given to the Cinémathèque Française, is it fair to ask what percentage of these texts have been cataloged and will be made available to people for research?
Truth is, I don't know. What I can say is that it's a work in progress. A lot of work has been done, and a lot of work is still to be done. Mainly if you include the digital archive, which is huge and which, to my knowledge, has hardly been explored. There are 9 very big hard drives. I had access to one of them. I could spend the rest of my nights circulating into them. It's so rich. It's made of his own product, or some things he made up. either visual or written or sound, etc. But it's also composed of thousands and thousands of elements he would grab from all over there. I remember once going to meet him in his place. He had 8 magnetoscopes, videotape recorder, each of them connected with some foreign television. And he was recording the Kazakhstan state television of the time all the day long and night long. I said, well, why is it interesting? I say, you never know. Maybe there is something there you can use someday. And he has this kind of accumulative madness, one could say, or impulse at least, which translate into this immense amount of documents, which are so interesting in their content, but also in the way they are organized. They are put together by him. In the catalog, one of the most meaningful object we show is the way he did with books. He didn't used to write, take notes inside books, as many people do, but he would stuff books with other documents. So books becomes like magic boxes full of other things. And the way they were organized on his bookshelves were also very specific. So all of this makes it some way an endless work to catalog everything, to depict everything that he left behind. But there are already archives which are available and can be accessed to at the French Cinémathèque for researchers. And if you ask to the Bibliothèque du Film, you would have access to some of them, but it is only, as far as I know, a small part of it.
Thank you. I wanted to comment a little bit after hearing the discussion today. The title I gave to the introduction is The Marker Moment, Writing and the Marker Moment. And I think I can become confessional here and say that my first marker moment was seeing La Jetée at the University of Wisconsin in 1964. And when that film begins, I get goosebumps whenever I see it, and I see it quite often. But this project, for me, was inspired by a flash moment, another moment marqueur, which is the beginning of Letter from Siberia, which starts on a black screen and in which we hear the sound of a typewriter, so that writing again becomes the opening gesture for the film. And I think that we are moving toward a multiplicity of marker moments. I want to begin by saying, what do we do now? What are the next directions? We're in a multiple series of marker moments. This year alone, there are English language editions of his non-film writings in Esprit. Another book came out translating Le DPI, and Sally and I have already come across 2 articles, one in German, but we need to translate that. So I believe, as you said, Jean-Michel, this is an ongoing and endless topic. And what we hope to have accomplished in this 4 years of work together, Sally and I, is to present a chunk, a coherent selection that would show the importance of this early period as formative and the role that writing plays in his ongoing evolution.
Yeah, I just want to second what Steve just said about us being in a marker moment. There is a new book expected out called Eternal Current Events, translated by Jackson B. Smith. And he has translated an entirely different selection of Marker's writings from Esprit. Absolutely no overlap between his book and our book. And in addition, the Film Desk, as Steve just mentioned, has brought out a beautiful edition of Le DPI with an introduction by the poet Sadie Rebecca Starnes. Finally, as translator, I would be remiss if I didn't also mention that Marker, who was hired by the U.S. Army at the end of the war as interpreter, was himself active in this period as a translator. And his work as a translator really remains understudied. In 1952, he published a French translation of the James Thurber E.B. White, Is Sex Necessary, or Why Do You Feel the Way You Do? And the following year, he published a translation of Will Cuppy's The Decline and Fall of Practically Everybody. A full list of Marker's translations, as well as his other work, can be found on the superb Marker website, chrismarker.ch.
Sorry, no, I would like to say a few more words about the text you already published, because, of course, we've been talking about Chris Marker and how important he is, and there is still a lot to say, including in terms of what's coming up or hopefully coming up in terms of publication. Raymond Bellour and myself have been working on putting together all the comments he wrote, the voices over. He wrote for all the films he made, plus a huge amount of films by other filmmakers who asked him to write the film comments because he was so great in this specific exercise, which is a kind of literature. Just briefly going back to the text you published, Stephen, and you translated, Sally, I would like to say how much important I think it is to read them now, to have a very specific, maybe unique access to a way to address cinema. Cinema sometimes in terms of specific films or sometimes in terms of national films or styles or different kind of angles to relate with cinema. But in each of these cases to develop this multifaceted approach that is able to be at the same time. Sam used the words both intimacy and distance, but I would even go further because the distances are multiple. It has very intimate, he says, he tells a personal story which relates with the world geopolitics, which relates with history of cinema, which relates with economy, which relates of literary backgrounds, which relates with his knowledge of the personal history of several people involved in the topic he's addressing, which relates with the way it has been seen and commented elsewhere. And it's in our world where there is so many kind of specialization and reductive ways to write and talk about cinema and many other things, among these things, cinema. I think it is a kind of a exceptional model. It's about style, but if you accept style in a very large and deeply meaning world of ways to relate with the world at large together with very specific objects and your own knowledge and feelings, that offers a, if not unique, exceptional way to relate with cinema. And for me, it should be read by students who will be writing about cinema in the future as something different from almost everything they have access to in our days.
Jean-Michel, it was great, what you just said. And I think you see that even in individual pieces in the collection. I think that's why I like the Cocteau essay so much, is because it starts out with this very specific description of a screening that was held for a specific audience. And so there's a little bit of reception history, which Marker is very interested in at the time, I think. And maybe that's one big difference between the kind of cultural work that Peuple et Culture were doing after the war and the 1930s, where there was this also desire to create the maison de culture, culture houses, and make culture accessible. It wasn't a kind of top-down, like, let's teach the workers Shakespeare, or whatever. It was really this idea of an exchange between the audience and the work. And I think that comes to the fore in the anthology at multiple points, but the Cocteau essay starts there. And then from there, you get this much wider ranging essay, which crosses over into an analysis of Cocteau's writing, which deals with Cocteau's history as a person, which goes on to reflections about aesthetics, which deals with death, which deals with cultural history. And it's this amazing, I think you're right, Jean-Michel, sort of unique approach where in just sort of pulling on a tiny thread, you get the entire world that ends up coming out, one way or the other. And I would hope from here on out, I think we all agree there's more work to do, and that's really exciting. The idea of bringing more of Marker's work into English, making it more accessible, and kind of continuing this process of, it's a kind of democratization project, where because you just want of accessibility, trying to make the work as accessible as it can be to as large an audience as possible. And I would hope as well that would maybe be accompanied by the reemergence of the broader field in which his work was taking shape. And I guess in particular, I'd love to see more Nicole Vedres's work, whose work I love and have taught and written about and defended for a long time. And I know Ivan Sherachina has recently translated a beautiful essay she did called Les Feuilles Bougent, and his work, I think his translation is called The Leaves Are Stirring. which is the essay about the reinvention of editing in the French context in the post-war period. It's an amazing essay that theorizes with a really, really light touch the idea of how to put images and sound and images together. And it's an amazing piece. And I would hope that since she also had a career as a writer and a filmmaker, we might see more of her work in time. And I guess even, Jean-Michel, I wish your work were more accessible in English as well. I'm still waiting for we're all waiting for the translation of L'Âge moderne du cinéma français, right? The film history you wrote from the new wave to the present, which to me was another big part of my film school. And I can't think of another. We have Alan Williams' great book, Republic of Images in English, but your work is such a great counterpoint to that work, which goes so deep in unfolding the multiple domains and the multiple shapes that cinema has taken since the end of World War II. One would hope that this sort of marker moment might lead to bigger moments involving French cinema and the people who were close to him throughout his life.
I'm available.
I'm ready.
Let's make it happen.
This has been a University of Minnesota Press production. The book Chris Marker, Early Film Writings, edited by Steve Unger and translated by Sally Shafto, is available from University of Minnesota Press. Thank you for listening.